Okay, so I am just going to moderate the question and answer period.
So I think that something that was addressed by each of you were different criticisms of BDS by Zionists or just pro-Israel generally. And I think that if we're a more generous interpretation of some of the criticisms are that why Israel? There are many violators of international law in the world. The United States is one of them. Russia, China, Egypt, the list goes on. So why Israel? So then I guess the question would be, if BDS is, what other BDS movements would you like to see at the same time against other countries? If BDS against Israel is successful, what countries should be next on our list?
And I've done a lot of reading about the role of the left in colonialism, and it's not very pretty. So I don't know. I guess I was wondering, because a lot of the BDS strategy seems to focus on building coalitions with left-wing groups and left-leaning organizations and parties. What is the role of the left with regards to this colonialism, and is it an ally or an enemy or something neutral, or what?
Responses from the panel to any of the list of questions?
I have just a quick response to the why Israel.
You could say that about any single social movement unless you're happening to target the most god-awful one that's on the face of the earth at that specific moment in time. So I think that's the first problem with that question. But the second problem with the question is that it actually does too much. Because many of the people who say this say, don't get me wrong, I'm against the occupation. But then the question is, well, why the occupation then? If you're against BDS, why singling out for a boycott? Well, why are you singling out Israel at all for anything it does? Because whatever it is that you're opposing, again, you can be sure there are many, many other instances across the world, and some of them will be worse than what the state of Israel is doing. So, in a way, I think the response to BDS that says, why are you singling out Israel, could be extended not only to other cases, but could be extended to any single criticism. Any state. Why should the president say anything? Why should anybody say anything at all against the state of Israel when there are so many other things going on in this world that are as bad or as worse? We've got to deal with all of them first before we even open up our mouths about the state of Israel. So I think it's a wrongly construed question, whose only function really, of course, is to just say, let's just do nothing at all about the state of Israel.
I agree with that entirely. I think that's what logicians call a false dilemma, right? So that's just in terms of the rational angle. That said, I want to just highlight, another way that I could answer that question and have, and that is around the role of the U.S. government in Israel. And I reject the concept of complicity. Complicity just means you're witnessing a crime and don't do anything about it. That's different than backing with state power and financial capital the crime itself. That's an issue of responsibility and culpability. And so that's another angle. But I could oppose it on other grounds. I could oppose it as an indigenous woman who's against occupations all over the world. I think for me what's so compelling is the call from Palestinian civil society, right? And that is meaningful to me. That's what the Palestinian people have called on the rest of the world to do, is to not cross those lines. And that, for me, is an issue of self-determination, which I find vitally important as an indigenous individual.
On the East Europe question, which is a tough one, yeah, possibly that's the only region on Earth that's not going very well for the Palestinians. Every other part of the world, Israel is losing. And in East Europe, it doesn't have mass support. It doesn't have grassroots support. But governments are certainly in bed with Israel for many, many reasons that are too complex to elaborate on here. But there's a budding kind of BDS activism in some parts of Eastern Europe, and they're connecting with Western Europe activists. So when some British activists, especially the British, they're great, when they go to Eastern Europe, they light it up. And they start working with activists there, students with students, women with women, LGBT with LGBT, and so on. And they start really to indigenize a BDS movement in Eastern Europe. It is taking a long time, but I think we'll get there. On the left, and then I'll answer the singling out Israel issue. Actually, the BDS movement is not a left movement. I hate to break the news. It's human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international law, that's liberal. That's as liberal as it gets, right? So every decent liberal should support freedom, justice, equality. That's the slogan of the BDS movement, equal rights. Hardly a left agenda. I mean, there's no Marx Engels hidden anywhere in the BDS agenda. Of course, we expect leftists to be foremost supporters of BDS, naturally. And we expect to build coalitions with progressive movements everywhere, from Ferguson to South Africa to India to Brazil and so on. Everywhere, we expect progressives to be our main allies. But we expect liberals as well to support BDS. And in fact, when there was a legal challenge to BDS in this country, in the states that were mentioned, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and even the US Congress, the New York Times editorial board defended us. They said, you know, we're very clear on our position on Israel, our credentials are set, but it's First Amendment. They have a right to do BDS.
As did the ACLU and the AAP.
Yes, yes. So I think it's wrong to frame BDS as entirely in the left camp, because we aim to mainstream BDS and to reach out to all camps except bigots, you know, right-wing bigots and so on. We should reach out to everyone. Now, the issue of singling out Israel, I agree with what was said, but I happen to have some quotes that say exactly what I want to say, so I'll just quote it. Henry Seidman, who was the head of the American Jewish Congress, and so he was a foremost lobbyist for Israel, and then he became a critical voice in academia of Israel and started writing. He said in Haaretz, December of last year, "Those who have not challenged the singling out of Israel for the unprecedented support it is receiving from the United States have no ground for the challenge of the BDS movement's singling out of Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians. BDS supporters would have had no reason for their initiative if Israel had not been favored for that support, even as it disenfranchises and dispossesses other people under its occupation." So your tax money is singling out Israel. We're not singling out Israel. You're giving Israel a preferential treatment. Your government is protecting Israel, not just at the United Nations, pumping arms and money and everything else. That engenders a moral responsibility, not just for US academics, for US citizens at large. There's an indirect responsibility. So as Martin Luther King said, boycott at a very basic level is withdrawing support for an evil system, which is not heroic. It's a basic, profound moral obligation, right? Ending your partnership in crime is not heroic. So we're not asking Americans to stop working on whatever else they're working on, any other causes they're working on. We're saying you can continue doing that, but at the very least, do no harm. Currently, you're doing harm. Your tax money is doing harm. Do no harm at the very least. You owe us that. We're entitled to that. So we're not asking for charity. We're asking for that basic moral decency. Also, Archbishop Desmond Tutu co-authored an article in 2002 about the singling out argument. And he said, "Divestment from apartheid South Africa was certainly no less justified because there was repression elsewhere on the African continent. In fact, repression on the African continent was far worse than South African apartheid in terms of number of people killed and injured and so on. In physical terms, it was much more awful. And the same argument applies to pinkwashing, LGBT rights, for example, which Israel always flashes. You know, we have better gay rights than the whole Arab world and Palestinian Authority and so on. That's plagiarized. They stole that out of the book of apartheid South Africa. South Africa used that same argument. And indeed, South Africa had better gay rights than the entire African continent. So what? They were still an apartheid regime. When it comes to Israel, we should not exonerate it simply because it has some aspect that's better than others. So having other repressive regimes does not mean that we cannot boycott that. The third and obvious argument is that as Palestinians, we start with our oppressors. Of course, we stand in solidarity with all causes against oppression and injustice, but we've got to call for boycotting our immediate oppressor. What is so illogical or wrong about that?
All right. Yeah, there are surely people in the audience here who would like to remind NYU of its responsibilities. And so how do we go about doing that in a very specific and technical way? And I think we have the advantage of having 3 people here who are not employees of our institution, who might be able to offer some technical advice on, you know, certain issues that have come up, certainly ones that I've heard circulating, ideas about disinvestment, and also the fact that NYU happens to have a study abroad program at Tel Aviv University. It's a very low profile program, and it's sort of kept low profile for all sorts of reasons. It's very seldom talked about here at a time when many of our programs overseas are under very heavy critical scrutiny. And some people think that's perhaps a little unfair that our study abroad program in Israel escapes that kind of scrutiny. So I mention that only because it's not well known, but also that the divestment issue is probably a larger one, and so I invite the panelists to, you know, offer some comments about how these 2 issues and others could be engaged constructively on the ground here.
Question to Omar. I was at the UN when Chomsky was talking, and he made a distinction between principles and tactics. And I'm not sure whether I agree with him, but I think it's we should respond to it, saying that, of course, right of return is a principle. We all support it. But is it tactically the right thing to do to build a movement in this country? That was his exactly what, and I'm quoting him. So I'm asking whether you think that we can maintain our principles and also have different tactics around some of these things. And it's a complex question. Maybe it has also to do with the last question a lot about how we build a movement in the universities or wherever we are.
Shout.
Some academics charge the accusation of BDS as a so-called clever way to challenge Israel's existence, as if that's such like a dangerous and horrible thing to do. So I'm really glad that you mentioned, that Omar mentioned in this talk, that mobilizing solely against the occupation and not challenging Israel as a Jewish Zionist state is ultimately beneficial for Israel because it just strengthens the apartheid aspect. Could you elaborate more on that, as well as how Palestinians who are Israel's demographic and existential threats are affected, you know, beyond the occupation, and why it's so important, you know, to shift the conversation from, you know, just tackling that and going beyond that? Because even as a student in SJP, I feel like we're, you know, trying to hold ourselves back from saying too much because we don't want to, you know, alienate people or come off as anti-Semitic or anything like that. But I feel like we need to open up the conversation beyond occupation, especially here in New York City.
So there are 2 more questions, yours and yours in the back. Sorry, yes, so 3, because yours was up 2, yes.
My question, I think, extends directly from yours. We've seen some liberal Zionists, like Peter Beinart, say that BDS campaigns which focus on the occupation, which most of them do in this country, boycotts of settlement goods, etc., that these are ultimately good for Israel because they have the effect of legitimizing Israel within what many countries recognize as its borders. And when they make this case, it doesn't sound entirely nonsensical to me. I don't know. Are you at all worried they could be correct?
There needs to be a national campaign, obviously, someday to stop all U.S. aid to Israel. And from the tenor of the discussion, it seems to me like some people see this BDS campaign as a prelude, building the groundwork to launch such a campaign.
It seems as though it's been institutionalized in our country to protect Israel and its positions by both the media and our government. And as this woman was saying, and someone else, is this what you think is one of the most targeted approaches in order to expose that? Or are there other alternatives that you see? And why do you think it's so institutionalized?
Okay.
Okay, I'll start, and actually I forgot the right of return part of your question, so I'll connect it to that. Sorry about that. I'll start with the NYU Tel Aviv, and thanks for raising that. Of course, we're calling for ending all kind of exchange programs with all Israeli universities, Tel Aviv being a primary target, in fact. Tel Aviv is not just deeply involved in developing military systems for the Israeli army, enabling it to commit its war crimes and crimes against humanity. Tel Aviv takes pride in developing the military doctrine used to commit the horrible massacres in Gaza, called the Dahya Doctrine. Dahya, which is the southern suburb of Beirut. Since 2006, Tel Aviv, together with the army, the military industries, and government in Israel, worked on a very prolonged workshop to develop this doctrine. And this doctrine basically says that in asymmetric warfare, where Israel is not capable of easily defeating irregular resistance forces like Hezbollah, Hamas, Jihad, and so on, the most effective way to suppress resistance is by hurting civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure, destroying civilian assets, so that they will push civilians by proxy to stop the resistance. Imagine, I mean, that's the definition of a war crime, this collective punishment for crime against humanity, in fact. And that was developed at Tel Aviv University. So Tel Aviv would be a primary target for a boycott in all fields. So an exchange program with Tel Aviv directly violates the boycott. There's another pragmatic aspect that I think should be used in such a campaign, and it's been used in San Francisco and elsewhere. In all these exchange programs, study abroad and so on, there are no conditions put on Israeli universities to respect equality, for example. So if somebody raises the issue of equality, how can NYU have a relationship with a university that discriminates openly that Palestinian American students cannot participate, will not be allowed to enter that program? How can NYU even accept that, forgetting everything else Tel Aviv University is doing and the boycott and everything? Just on this pragmatic ground, how can it get away with that? Being in bed with an apartheid institution like Tel Aviv that openly does not give equal rights. So yes, I would encourage a two-pronged approach, an ethical approach as well as a pragmatic one. On Chomsky and the right of return, I shall not address Chomsky per se, out of respect for his history. We do not debate Chomsky, we do not attack Chomsky. Otherwise, I could take a long time. But out of respect for his history, we prefer not to touch Chomsky. We have respect for his past. But on the issue of right of return, it's quite strange, really. I mean, we never heard that argument except when it came to Israel. In no other refugee situation did we ever, from any intellectual, let alone a left intellectual, did we hear the argument that, let's be pragmatic, if refugees return, that will make things unstable. If Kosovo refugees, Bosnian refugees, Darfur refugees, Tibet refugees, if refugees, Jewish refugees of World War II, if they all return, it's a disaster, it's a demographic disaster. You never heard that. It would be so bluntly racist. But for some reason, when it comes to Israel, it's accepted discourse, acceptable discourse, which is really, really strange. Our rights as humans are inalienable, and we do not need affirmation from Zionists or otherwise, whether we are entitled to those rights or not. We're entitled to those rights as humans, as equal humans to everyone else. If this makes some people uncomfortable, that's their problem. If it changes the demographic balance for a colonial society that was built on ethnically cleansing us, what's wrong with that? On BDS challenging Israel's existence, we do not challenge Israel's existence per se, we challenge Israel's existence as an apartheid state. As Gideon Levy in one article said, the challenge of BDS is to the regime, not to the people. So we should make that distinction very, very clear, because Zionist propaganda is based on the Holocaust. That, oh, it's another Holocaust. They want to throw us to the, no, we don't want to throw anyone to the sea. We want to end a regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That doesn't say we have anything against people per se. Certainly not against Jews, and certainly not against Israelis as Jews, but as oppressors. We couldn't care less what the identity of our oppressor is. So long as they're oppressing us, we'll continue to resist them. So, and we cannot, stop our rights at a certain border, an artificial border that Israel and colonial powers drew. That, if you're Palestinian in the 67 border, it's okay to demand your rights. But if you're beyond, it's inconvenient. So you should shut up. No, we won't shut up. We want the full menu of rights, as Desmond Tutu said. Peter Beinart, yeah, some people call that kosher BDS. And I'm not making this up. I mean, they did, in print, say we should go for a kosher BDS. BDS against settlements only, because otherwise you're delegitimizing Israel as a whole. And some would say, pragmatically, of course, they have no problem, they're very open-minded and so on, that won't work in this country. If you go for a full BDS, what they call a full BDS, that won't work in this country. Look at the ASA. Yeah. So Peter Beinart is so 2 years ago. I mean, post-ASA, how can he even make that argument? The Asian American studies, the indigenous studies, there's so many associations in this country that have supported a full academic boycott of Israel. Not of the occupation of Israel, the state of Israel, its entire institutions, academic institutions. And you know what? They did not collapse. And they increased their funding and membership, and they grew, and nothing happened. The world did not collapse when big American institutions decided to call for a boycott of Israel. So I think Peter Beinart is just a bit anachronistic. Stopping US aid to Israel, yes, absolutely. That's the main sanction we want. But if anyone has the illusion that Congress will wake up and be moral, I mean, it won't. It never was, and it never will be. Ethics just is like Swahili in Congress. It's not something that they understand, with all due respect. I mean, those are political animals that were placed there by lobbies. Even Thomas Friedman says Congress is bought and paid for by the lobby. I'm quoting. That's what Thomas Friedman said, not Che Guevara. So to get to sanctions, cutting US aid to Israel, the ultimate goal, we've got to do a lot of boycotting and divestment. That's what we did in the South Africa anti-apartheid movement, which I was a tiny little part of at Columbia University. You've got to do a lot of boycott divestment at the grassroots level to push the power circles to take decisions.
Okay, so we'll take maybe one more round, and then we'll let our panel go. So, yes.
How is the BDS movement addressing the Cornell Technion problem, where they're trying to cement us with cement shoes into the whole academic Israeli complex, military, and students, and so forth? I hope I said that well.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on the yes. I wanted to comment on the recent findings, and it's also academic, of a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University, who actually proved that actually the whole concept that the Jewish people are actually Middle Eastern people is actually false. So based on that note, the whole story about returning to the allegedly homeland of the biblical Jews is actually, it's a manufactured lie. And that also has another corollary, which is not brought up, that actually religiously Jews are not Jews. They're not biblical Jews. There may be a religious like cult, which is a Judaesque cult, but it's not biblical Judaism. And in that sense, both on the nation side and the religious side, they have no legitimacy to be claiming Palestine as their historic homeland. Thank you.
In November 2013, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, a Malaysian organization, in 2007, basically convicted convicted the state of Israel guilty of genocide of the Palestinian people, and convicted former Israel General Amos Yaron for crimes against humanity and genocide for the involvement in the Sabra and Shatila massacre. If people actually know about that. And obviously, we can't rely on the United Nations to enforce the, its principles. What do we do as citizens? Have you heard the thing called the common law movement? A movement for return to principles of natural law and common law. And do these have any clout with people? And can they be enforced?
Yeah. So the talk about the U.S. support of Israel as the root cause, or a root cause of culpability. Is there a call for a BDS movement against the U.S.?
Anyone else? Okay, so final round for the panelists. Anything you'd like to respond to? No?
Just got two comments that have come up. The question about are Jews, the people who lived in Israel, in biblical Palestine 2,000 years ago. I think it's sort of a red herring, to be honest with you. Let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that I'm Jewish and my ancestors did live in biblical Palestine. Let's just assume it. From a moral point of view, it's very hard for me to say that just because my ancestors lived there 2,000 years ago, I'm more entitled than people whose parents and grandparents have lived and been exiled from there. I don't think we need to get into long biblical exegesis in order to kind of reconcile the justice of this issue. Which is why, when people say, oh, the right of return, and here I'm speaking as a Jew, I get upset when people dismiss the aspiration of Palestinians to the right of return and dismiss it in a very callous way and get over it. Get over 1948. Get over 1948. And I think our entire, and I'm speaking, our Jewish entire liturgy is based on the premise of not getting over something that happened 2,000 years ago. And yet, we're telling people, of something that happened in real historical time, not messianic time, not biblical time, but real historical time to get over something. It's there's something a little disproportionate about that. But the point being that I think we don't need to get into this debate about are Jews really Jewish people who were from there. This from my point of view, a Jew is somebody who claims they're Jewish, and that's enough. I don't want to get into, identity, show me your passport proof. That's not the point of this, and I don't think we need to go there. But then one other quick comment about the sort of kosher BDS. It's funny because I actually have sort of the opposite reaction. I think some people worry that this sort of milder BDS is going to Omar brought this up, legitimize, kind of Israel, but I've actually been stunned by the opposite, which is people who claim, no, I'm really against the occupation. Well, right now there's a petition at Princeton University calling for Princeton to divest from companies that profit from or contribute to the occupation on the West Bank. And almost nobody signs it. All these people who claim they're, against the occupation, they won't do a goddamn thing to oppose it. So I see these as opportunities for kind of strategic engagement with people to say, if you're really against this, tell me one damn thing you're willing to do to stop it. And the answer is, pretty much nothing. And then at that point, well, then it's time to have a real conversation. What are we really talking about here? So I'm less concerned, frankly, about those campaigns because I think they're a very good opportunity to engage with people who claim that they really are, opposed to the occupation, but when push comes to shove, are not willing to do anything about it.
Yes. Okay, just a couple quick responses. I wanted to touch on the study abroad really briefly around academic, as that is an aspect of academic boycott, which I didn't get into. and also the Technion question around the partnership with Cornell and Technion. To me, I should have actually brought both of those up in my presentation because they also speak to different kinds of materiality, especially with the Technion-Cornell partnership, which is, big bucks, right? And there are activists working locally here in New York City on that, as well as people at Cornell. And it's been really difficult. It's been so difficult precisely because there's so much capital involved. And I think that that's actually a prime example of another element of resistance, but also to show how much is at stake in that part of the academic boycott. When people say there's no economic piece to academic boycott, we can actually look at that as a case study to show that is just one of many examples, and even the example that you're talking about when you're talking about what gets crafted at Tel Aviv and sort of exported in terms of the technological piece. So I think that's part of it. The thing around SJP and not wanting to alienate, I was at the National SJP conference at Tufts University, and I heard this from many people throughout the weekend, many undergraduates especially. I know that there's graduate students as well in SJP, really feeling like they're being pressured to talk with Hillel on campus, and not open Hillel, but pressured by their deans, by their professors, by high-level administration. They're being pushed to turn into J Street, to just be completely dismantled. Some of them are being banned to even exist as SJP. And I see SJP as really on the front lines. And for me, that's another counterpart to the role of academic boycott in the US Academy, is to really be linking up with SJP, even though SJP categorically sort of doesn't come in on BDS. There's not one uniform position on that. But really to try and have those partnerships, and I encourage SJP students to try and identify faculty and staff on your campuses who have endorsed the campaign and or in a more limited sense, say endorsed divestment prospects, say with TIAA CREF, that you can at least find a point of connection to actually be talking and partner up so that you're not just kind of out there alone and under attack. Because SJP, especially on the West Coast, legally, are really taking a beating. And not to say that there's not attacks on the East Coast, but when you look at ANCHA getting in on the University of California system, there's just broad-based legal attack, the lawfare angle. The issue around study abroad, whether it's NYU or other campuses, you asked the question of how can they get away with it because it's so openly discriminatory racially. I think there just needs to be a massive legal case on this. Because those institutions that receive, and even a private school like NYU, if they receive even a penny of federal funding, which all of them do, Wesleyan has no study abroad any longer, but if they did, they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to lose their federal funding if they have anything institutionalized that is racially discriminatory. So that's ripe for legal suit. And who knows, maybe SJP could coordinate and maybe do 50 test cases across the country and see who's willing to do that. But again, who does that put the burden on? I don't want to go without saying, that puts the burden on the individual Palestinian again, in that case, or Palestinian people. So there'd have to be some real infrastructure to support people who are willing to do that, and people understanding sort of the full risks involved in something like that. I do want to touch base on the indigeneity question around Middle Eastern Jews or Mizrahi. And I don't want to talk about the biblical era or the Bible, but I do think that when people try and use the indigeneity question as the arguing point, it gets messy really quickly, and you see what pushes people's buttons. Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, even though I should have clarified, it wasn't an actual resolution, it was council making a declaration. We did actually mobilize, I worked with a group to try and push on a resolution, and the council at the time didn't actually decide to go with the resolution. They wanted it to be declarative as council. And I wondered if there would be challenges at the next meeting because it wasn't sort of institutionalized in a way that I wanted to see. And there had been talk behind the scenes that there might be a big ruckus at the big business meeting, which several hundred people attend. It's a 1,000-person scholarly association. We get about 300 to 400 people at our business meetings. It's a really good turnout. And the council kind of presented themselves and said, we know that there's been some questions and controversy over the academic boycott declaration, and we want to open up a space for anybody to air their concerns. Who wants to go first? you could have heard a pin drop. Not one person, not one academic grabbed the mic. I mean, that's a feat right there, right? But you see, Native American studies really blew up in a different kind of way. People didn't hear about NISA, Native American and Indigenous Studies, until the ASA passed its reso. And then, because NISA passed the declaration, really within a few days, it was all in December, but actually, sorry, then you had the vote come out later in ASA. Sorry, I'm kind of mixing up the timeline, and that's because council had actually endorsed it and then put it to a vote to the membership for the ASA. But that's when people found out about the Native studies. They found out when they found out about the ASA vote, because it got covered in the same kind of media. And that really, people went ballistic, because as soon as you have Native, anything that says Native American, questioning Israel, that's going for the jugular, right? That's going for the jugular, and that's why you have with Brand Israel the whole effort to redwash. You know, the Native kind of counterpart to pinkwashing, which is the Israeli government and its subsidiaries courting tribal leaders all throughout North America and getting them in these junkets that are fully paid, hooking them up with commercial adventures with corporations. I mean, the Navajo president had a mega tour and is now, you know, meeting with people who do agribusiness to, you know, let the desert bloom in the Southwest here in North America. So that stuff is really real. But I do want to say that we don't need to deny indigenous Jews. They're the Arabs, right? There's a difference between European Jews that come over and colonize and the fact that you have Christian Palestinians. You know, you have Christian, I'm not talking about in the contemporary moment, but you have what you'd say present-day Palestinians who are of all faiths, and you have Arab Jews, Arab Christians, and Arab Muslims, obviously. So the issue around that, to me, is a red herring, but I think there's other ways to kind of look at it in terms of thinking through the colonial piece. And with that, I just want to let people know about two works that they might want to check out if they don't already know. Israeli historian Shlomo Sand has a book on this called The Invention of the Jewish People. And then also Columbia or Barnard University, or Barnard College professor Nadia Abu Al-Haj, her book, The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology. I mean, I think those are two different kinds of entry points into that debate over trying to prove that indigenous piece.
Okay, well, before we thank our panelists and wind up for the evening, I did want to take one final moment to both thank the SJP folks, Maya Wend and Alice Gary, for doing the work organizing. The Valiant NYU SJP chapter is in the process of beginning to work on a divestment campaign, and if you are a faculty member who would be willing to be supported, would you please come and talk to Maya and Ellis and let them know? Okay, so, where are we? Okay, great. Maya and Ellis. Do you want to just stand up? I mean, I saw you at the beginning, but there they are. Okay, so thank you, Omar, and thank you so much, Corey and Kailani, for coming to speak to us today. Really, thank you.